The Civil War era was a time when old authorities were collapsing and new ones were rapidly emerging. It was in this boiling cauldron, where courage was valued above pedigree and loyalty to the cause was the main criterion for selection, that commanders such as Ion Yakir were tempered. He was not a product of the old military school. His universities were the battlefields, and his tactics were born not from dusty regulations but from the harsh necessity to survive and win. His career is a mirror reflecting the very essence of the young Soviet power, a rapid social ladder for those who selflessly embraced its ideals. Autumn 1918, the Southern Front. Red Army units are retreating under pressure from the Whites. There is panic, disorder, and desertion everywhere. And then a young, energetic commissar appears before the weary, disheartened soldiers. He does not have the bearing of a career officer, but he has an unyielding will and fiery conviction. He does not give orders from his headquarters tent. He leads his men into battle himself. This man is Ion Yakir. At the age of 22, he is already commanding a group of troops, and soon an entire army. His name is as famous as those of Frunze, Bujani, and Tukhachevsky. He was one of those who literally forged victory in the fire of civil war. After the war, his rise did not slow down. Yakir became one of the key architects of the new, modern Red Army. He commanded the largest military districts, including the strategically important Kyiv Special Military District. Under his leadership, large-scale exercises were conducted, new technology was introduced, and the then-advanced theories of deep offensive operations were practiced. He was not just a military leader. He was part of the system, its flesh and blood. His entire life, his status, his authority were inextricably linked to the Soviet government and the party. He could not imagine himself outside this system because it had created him. Some historians believe that this is the root of his subsequent, almost irrational loyalty. He owed everything not to an abstract homeland, but to a specific political force and its leader. The spring of 1937 in Kiev was warm and blooming. Life went on as usual. Commander of the district, first-rank Army Commander Ion Yakir, one of the 5 highest military commanders in the country, awarded 3 Orders of the Red Banner, was at the peak of his power. His office in the district headquarters building on Benkova Street was the center of military life throughout Ukraine. From here, orders were given to thousands of people, and all information about the state of the troops, ready at any moment to repel an attack from the west, flowed in. It seemed that nothing could shake this position. But on 28 May, everything changed. It was not a high-profile arrest with a shootout like in the movies. Everything happened in a mundane way, which made it even more sinister. People from the NKVD entered his office. They presented a warrant signed in Moscow. The charges, read out in a dry, impassive voice, sounded like the ravings of a madman: participation in a military fascist conspiracy and espionage in favor of Germany. For Yakir, a Jew by nationality and one of the most ardent opponents of Nazism, this accusation was not just a lie, it was absurd, a mockery of his entire life. His arrest was not accidental or the result of personal animosity. It was one of the first and most high-profile acts in a case that would go down in history as the Tukhachevsky affair, the total purge of the Red Army's top command. The wheel of repression, set in motion in Moscow, rolled all the way to Kiev to claim one of its main victims. For Yakir, this event was the collapse of his world. He could not believe that the system he had served faithfully, which he had built and defended, could have made such a mistake. In his mind, it could only have been a monstrous provocation, the work of hidden enemies who had managed to deceive the party and Comrade Stalin himself. This was not the downfall of a naive idealist. It was the collapse of a man whose reality, built on unconditional faith in the system, collided with its own ruthless logic, and he was unable to accept that the world he had created had turned against its creator. The transfer from Kyiv to Moscow itself was staged like an ominous spectacle. It was no longer a commander's trip to the capital in a staff carriage with adjutants and honors at every station. It was a stage. Yakir, stripped of his insignia, was transported under heavy guard in a special carriage attached to a regular passenger train. For the thousands of people who saw this train, it was just one of many. But for the man inside it, it was a journey into oblivion. One can only guess what thoughts were running through his head during those long hours. He probably replayed his conversations, meetings, and orders over and over again in his mind, trying to find that fateful mistake, that careless step that could be interpreted as treason. He recalled his conversations with Tukhachevsky about the need to modernize the army, about the shortcomings of Bedonia's cavalry, about his disputes with Voroshilov. Could these purely military, professional discussions have formed the basis for accusations of conspiracy? In his mind, shaped by the logic of party discipline, criticism of individual shortcomings could not be equated with treason. He believed in Stalin as an arbiter, as a wise leader who, once he had sorted things out, would surely punish those guilty of this monstrous slander. This belief was his only lifeline in an ocean of absurdity. Upon his arrival in Moscow, his world shrank to the size of a cell in the NKVD's internal prison on Lubyanka. Here, there were no more ranks, no more merits, no more orders. Here, there was only the investigator and the suspect. The interrogation began, which in the documents is dryly referred to as investigative actions, but in reality was a methodical, years-long destruction of the human personality. The system, known as the conveyor belt, worked flawlessly. Interrogations were conducted in shifts, around the clock, without a break for sleep. The investigators changed, remaining fresh and aggressive, while the suspect slowly sank into a foggy state between sleep and reality, where the line between truth and fiction was blurred. He was not allowed to sleep for days on end. The bright light of a lamp shining in his face, monotonous voices repeating the same questions, threats and false promises, all this was part of a well-honed technique. His chief interrogator was Senior Major Ushakov of the State Security Service. He was not just a jailer, but a sophisticated psychologist. He did not start with brute force. First, he tried to break Yakir morally. The interrogation reports of his comrades in arms, Primakov, Putna, Feldman, were laid out on the table in front of him. In these papers, written under the dictation of investigators like Ushakov, his friends and comrades confessed to participating in the conspiracy and named Yakir as one of its leaders. For the commander, this was a terrible blow. He saw the signatures of people with whom he had shared bread and salt in the trenches of the Civil War, and he could not believe that they could have betrayed him. Investigator Ushakov patiently explained, "They have already understood everything. They have repented before the party and the people. Only you are stubborn, Ion Emmanailovich. Do you want to go against the party?" It was diabolical logic. Admitting guilt was presented not as a betrayal of oneself, but as the highest act of party valor, as the last service to the cause to which he had devoted his life. In this twisted system of coordinates, insistence on one's innocence was interpreted as an enemy sortie, as an attempt to cause division, as the ultimate proof of guilt. And when psychological pressure did not produce the desired result, physical violence was used. Historians who have studied the archives confirm that Yakir was beaten. A man who commanded armies and was accustomed to unquestioning obedience was humiliated, beaten, and broken. But the most terrible weapon in the hands of the investigators was his family. He was told directly that if he did not sign a confession, his wife, Sara Lazarovna, and his 14-year-old son Peter would be destroyed as accomplices of the enemy of the people. He was made to understand that his stubbornness was a death sentence for his loved ones. It was a choice between the unthinkable and the impossible. It was at this point, at the limit of human endurance, that the letter to Stalin was born. It was not just a cry of despair. It was a last, desperate attempt to reach the top of the very system that was grinding him down. Analyzing the text of the letter, one can see several layers. The first, most obvious one, is an appeal to the leader as the last resort of justice. Yakir probably still believed that Stalin did not know the whole truth, that he was being deceived by schemers from the NKVD. He tried to convey his unwavering loyalty and love, hoping that the leader would see him not as an enemy, but as a loyal soldier who had fallen into trouble. "I will die with words of love for you, for the party and for the country." This is not just flattery, it is a formula of faith, a password by which, he hoped, his own would recognize his own. The second layer was an attempt to protect his family. By swearing allegiance, he may have hoped to soften the fate of his wife and son, to show that even though he had been slandered, he remained a communist, and his family should not be branded as traitors. It was a weak, almost ghostly hope, but in his situation, he clung to any straw. Finally, there was a third, deepest, and most tragic layer. By signing the confession and at the same time swearing his love for Stalin, Yakir was perhaps performing the ultimate act of self-sacrifice as he understood it. If the party demanded that he become a traitor so that his example would demonstrate vigilance and unite the ranks in the face of enemies, then that was his last duty to the party. He had to play this role to the end so as not to harm the common cause. This logic, monstrous to modern man, was quite natural for many old Bolsheviks, for whom the party was an absolute, a higher value than personal honor and even life itself. Stalin's reaction to this letter was not just cruel, it was demonstratively humiliating. The resolution "scoundrel and prostitute," written in the margins of this cry from the heart, was addressed not to Yakir, whom he had already written off, but to his closest associates, Voroshilov, Molotov, and Kaganovich. It was a signal to them: no mercy, no doubts. Anyone who showed hesitation would find themselves in the defendant's place. Stalin did not simply destroy a man, he erased the very memory of his achievements, trampled on his last appeal, showing that in his system of coordinates there was no place for loyalty or past valor, only absolute submission to the will of the leader. The trial, which took place on 11 June 1937, was merely a formality, the final act of a staged spectacle. It was a closed session of the special judicial presence of the Supreme Court of the USSR. There were no lawyers or defense witnesses in the courtroom. 8 of the country's top military commanders sat in the dock: Tukhachevsky, Yakir, Uborevich, Kork, Eidemann, Feldman, Primakov, and Putna, the cream of the Red Army. And in the judges' chairs sat their former comrades in arms and superiors: Ulrich, Budeny, Blucher, Shaposhnikov, Alksnis, Belov, Dybenko, and Goryachev. Some of these judges, such as Blucher, Alksnis, Belov, and Dybenko, would soon find themselves in the dock and be shot. It was a bloody circle of mutual responsibility. The trial lasted only a few hours. The defendants were read the indictment, full of absurd statements about passing plans to the German general staff and preparing a military coup. No real evidence was presented, only their own confessions, extracted at Lubyanka. They were given the last word. According to witnesses, Yakir, like the others, did not recant his testimony. He understood that any protest would be futile and would only worsen the fate of his family. The verdict was known in advance. At 11:35 p.m., Ulrich read it out. All were to be sentenced to the highest punishment, execution by firing squad. On the night of 12 June, they were taken to the basement of the military collegium building. The procedure was quick and routine. NKVD Commandant Vasily Blokhin, the chief executioner of the Stalin era, personally carried out the sentences. It was his testimony that brought us the last words of Iona Yakir. When he was let out of his cell, he turned to the guards and, perhaps to the entire system that was destroying him, and shouted, "Long live the party! Long live Stalin!" What was this? The dying ravings of a broken man? A last attempt to prove his loyalty in the hope of a miracle? Or the highest manifestation of that very party logic, taken to the point of absurdity? To die with the name of the leader on your lips, even if that leader is your murderer? This question will remain unanswered forever. But this cry became a terrible symbol of the era. It showed how deeply totalitarian ideology can penetrate the human consciousness, forcing people to identify with their executioners until the very last moment. After his death, the repressive machine did not stop. His wife, Sara Lazarovna, was arrested and, refusing to give false testimony against her husband, was shot in 1938. Their son, Peter Yakir, went through the hell of orphanages and camps for family members of traitors to the motherland. He survived and, unlike his father, did not retain his faith in the system. He became one of the most famous dissidents of the 1960s and 70s, devoting his life to fighting the regime that his father had served so selflessly. This is another bitter irony of this story. Through his life and struggle, the son assessed the blind faith that had destroyed his father. Rehabilitation came only 20 years later, in 1957. The military collegium of the Supreme Court of the USSR, the very same body that had handed down the death sentence, overturned it on the grounds that there was no evidence of a crime. It was officially recognized that the entire military case had been fabricated. The names of Yakir, Tukhachevsky, and other executed military leaders were restored to history, and their ranks and awards were posthumously returned to them. But this could no longer change the tragedy. The system acknowledged its mistake, but did not condemn itself. It simply turned the page, leaving the main question unanswered. How and why was it possible that its most loyal sons were declared its worst enemies and destroyed with their silent consent, with the name of the leader on their lips? However, to understand the depth of this tragedy, we need to take a step back to the years when Yakir was not a victim but one of the most ruthless and effective instruments of Soviet power. The title of this story is no coincidence: The Blind Faith of the Executioner. Before the system made him a martyr, he himself was its faithful sword of punishment. His biography is inextricably linked with the suppression of peasant uprisings, in particular the famous Tambov uprising led by Antonov. It was Yakir, as one of the commanders of the punitive forces, who carried out Tukhachevsky's orders to use chemical weapons against the rebels and their families hiding in the forests. His orders to take hostages, shoot people on the spot, and set up concentration camps for the relatives of bandits have been preserved. He acted ruthlessly, with fanatical conviction that he was burning out the counter-revolutionary contagion. For him, these peasants were not the people. They were enemies, kulak scum, hindering the construction of a bright future. Similarly, commanding troops in Ukraine in the early 1930s, he was an active proponent of the policy of collectivization and dispossession of the kulaks, which led to the terrible Holodomor. His troops ensured that grain quotas were met, blocking villages and preventing starving people from leaving for the cities in search of food. He was not a passive observer. He was part of the mechanism that crushed millions of lives. And therein lies another key to understanding his psychology. He himself participated in the destruction of those whom the party designated as enemies. He saw how yesterday's heroes were declared traitors, how entire social strata were wiped off the face of the earth in the name of a higher goal. He accepted these rules of the game. He believed that the party had the right to decide who would live and who would die. And when this same mechanism turned against him, his consciousness, crippled by decades of such logic, was unable to rebel. He could not allow himself to think that the whole system was corrupt, because that would mean admitting that his whole life, all his bloody exploits, were senseless cruelty rather than revolutionary necessity. It was easier for him to believe in a mistake, in a conspiracy against Stalin, than to believe that Stalin himself was the source of this evil. To admit this would mean admitting that he was not a hero, but a criminal. The psychology of the old Bolsheviks, to whom Yakir undoubtedly belonged, is a phenomenon that is difficult for modern people to understand. For them, the party was not just a political organization. It was everything: family, religion, the meaning of life. It gave them a sense of belonging to a great historical process. Party membership required complete, absolute obedience, the renunciation of one's own I in favor of the collective we. Party discipline took precedence over personal conscience, friendship, and family ties. In this system of coordinates, the greatest sin was not the murder of an enemy, but doubting the righteousness of the party. Nikolai Bukharin, another prominent figure who was shot in 1938, in his last words at the trial, acknowledging the absurd charges, spoke of the peculiar monumental politics of Bolshevism. He explained that the logic of the struggle was such that if you disagreed with the party politically, you inevitably found yourself on the other side of the barricades, in the enemy camp. Yakir probably thought in similar terms. Since the party, in the person of its investigative bodies, was accusing him, it meant that, objectively, regardless of his personal intentions, he had become an enemy. And his last duty was to admit this, to help the party expose the conspiracy, even if it meant incriminating himself and others. It was the last monstrous sacrifice on the altar of the party deity. The international situation at that time should not be overlooked. In 1936, civil war broke out in Spain, which served as a rehearsal for the coming global carnage. The Soviet Union actively supported the Republicans, and its military advisors, including those who would later find themselves in the dock alongside Yakir, gained invaluable combat experience there. They saw the German war machine, the Condor Legion, in action. In Germany, Hitler was already building up his military power. The threat of war was not propaganda, but a harsh reality. Stalin and his entourage masterfully exploited this real fear. Any doubt, any criticism, any professional disagreement in the military environment was immediately interpreted as working for enemy intelligence. And there were disagreements. Yakir, like Tukhachevsky, was a proponent of deep offensive operations, a theory that relied on the massive use of tanks and aircraft to break through enemy defenses and strike deep into enemy territory. This advanced doctrine required proactive, well-educated commanders capable of making independent decisions in a rapidly changing environment. Their main opponent was People's Commissar of Defense Klement Voroshilov, an old cavalryman and hero of the Civil War, but completely incompetent in matters of modern warfare. He and his entourage, such as Budyonny, clung to outdated dogmas, extolling the role of cavalry and underestimating motorized units. Stalin deliberately supported Voroshilov in this dispute. It was not a matter of military strategy. Voroshilov was completely loyal, predictable, and obedient. Brilliant intellectuals such as Tukhachevsky and Yakir, with their authority in the army, independence of judgment, and European education, seemed to him a potential threat. He saw them not as supporters of the throne, but as potential Bonapartes, capable of leading the army behind them at a critical moment. By destroying them, Stalin solved two problems at once. He eliminated potential competitors and gained the opportunity to blame all future failures and miscalculations in preparation for war on the traitors. The accusation of spying for Germany fit perfectly. Who else but supporters of modern, German motorized warfare tactics could be German spies? To the average person, this sounded logical. The atmosphere at the trial itself was surreal. The courtroom was filled with people who, just yesterday, had served together, argued during training exercises, and drank at banquets. The judges looked at the defendants, and the defendants looked at the judges, and everyone understood that they were participating in a pre-scripted performance. The presiding judge was Vasily Orich, a man with the face of an impassive official and a reputation as a legal hitman. He monotonously read out questions that did not require answers and listened to pre-prepared confessions. Marshal Blucher, who sat on the bench, was reportedly pale and constantly wiping sweat from his forehead. As commander of the Far Eastern Army, he understood perfectly well that his hour was also near. And indeed, a little over a year later, he would be arrested and beaten to death during interrogations in the same Lubyanka prison. The judges signed the death warrants of their comrades in order to prolong their own lives for a few months. It was a system built on total fear and mutual responsibility sealed with blood. And in this context, Yakir's last cry, "Long live Comrade Stalin," takes on another, perhaps even more terrifying dimension. It may not have been just an act of faith or despair. It may have been a signal addressed to those who remained free, and first and foremost to his family. A signal that he had died without breaking in the most important thing, his loyalty to the system. In that twisted reality, it may have been the only way to try to save his wife and son, showing that he was not an enemy but a victim of a mistake, and that his family should not be held responsible for that mistake. He could not have known that his wife Sarah would show incredible courage and insist on her husband's innocence during all the interrogations, for which she would pay with her life. He could not have known that his son Peter, having gone through all the circles of hell in the Gulag, would find the strength not only to survive, but to become the voice of resistance. In his memoirs, Childhood in Prison, Peter Yakir wrote about how, as a teenager, he tried to understand his father's actions. He did not condemn him. He tried to explain his father's beliefs to the generation that had gone through the revolution and the Civil War. For them, Stalin was not just a man. He was a symbol of victory, a symbol of a cause for which rivers of blood had been shed. To renounce Stalin meant betraying themselves in their youth, betraying the graves of their comrades. Peter, who belonged to a different generation, the generation of children of the repressed, saw things differently. For him, the system that had killed his parents and crippled his life could not be justified. He wrote, "I realized that my father and his comrades were the last romantics of the revolution, who believed in the possibility of building a just society. Stalin was the pragmatic and cynical gravedigger of this revolution, who used their faith to consolidate his unlimited power." This assessment by his son is the most accurate and merciless condemnation of the blind faith that led his father to the execution cellar in Lubyanka. The tragedy of Iona Yakir is not just the story of one man. It is the story of an entire generation that created a monster and was devoured by it, continuing to believe in its greatness until its last breath. And this faith was all the more enduring because it was sealed with the blood of enemies. When you make history with your own hands, shooting hostages in the Tambov forests or sending saboteurs in your district to trial, you cannot allow yourself to doubt the righteousness of your cause. Otherwise, you would have to admit that your hands were not calloused from building a new world, but stained with the blood of innocence. Therefore, when the wheel of repression reached Yakir himself, his consciousness desperately clung to the only saving thought. This was a mistake, a provocation, the machinations of enemies who had managed to deceive the party and its leader. He could not believe that the system he served was cannibalistic in nature. He believed that it was only a temporary illness that the wise Dr. Stalin would surely cure. The atmosphere in the months leading up to the arrest was thick with a cloying, suffocating fear. It was not the fear of a soldier facing a bullet, but a paralyzing terror of the unknown. People were disappearing. Yesterday's comrade in arms, with whom you discussed training plans, did not answer your phone calls today, and his aide muttered something confusedly about an urgent trip to Moscow from which no one returned. At party meetings, you had to recite ritual curses against the recently arrested enemies of the people, knowing full well that just yesterday you had been patting this enemy on the shoulder in a friendly manner. Each such arrest was like a stone thrown into water. The ripples spread wider and wider, drawing in relatives, friends, and colleagues. As a member of the Central Committee, Yakir could not fail to see the scale of what was happening. He signed collective letters demanding severe punishment for the Trotskyist Zinovievist bandits and voted to expel the old Bolsheviks from the party. He was part of this ritual, hoping that his loyalty would serve as a letter of protection for him. The most cynical element of the accusation was espionage on behalf of Germany. NKVD investigators masterfully turned the real facts inside out. In the 1920s and early 1930s, when both the Soviet Union and the Weimar Republic were international pariahs, there was secret but high-level military cooperation between them. German officers trained Red commanders at military academies, and the Soviet side provided the Germans, who were bound by the restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles, with testing grounds for new technology. There was a tank school called Kama in Kazan and an aviation school in Lipetsk, where German pilots, future Luftwaffe aces, and Soviet pilots flew side by side. As one of the leaders of the Red Army, Yakir not only knew about this, he was directly involved in it, meeting with German military personnel and discussing technical issues. It was his job, his official duty. And now these authorized contacts, these official meetings, were being presented as recruitment attempts and the transfer of secret information. The investigator's logic was brutally simple. Did you meet with the Germans? Yes, you did. Therefore, you are a spy. Any attempt to explain that it was done on the orders of the government was cut short with the cry, "Don't try to drag the party and the government into your dirty business." This guillotine of purges did not fall randomly. It had its own conductor, and his name was Stalin. He skillfully played on the contradictions and ambitions of his subordinates. The conflict between innovators such as Tukhachevsky and Yakir and conservatives led by Voroshilov was an ideal tool for him. Voroshilov, the first Red officer, was a living icon of the Civil War, but as a military strategist, he was hopelessly stuck in the era of machine guns and cavalry attacks. He was terrified of and hated the brilliantly educated, foreign language-speaking theorists of the new war. He saw them as a threat to his authority and position. Stalin understood this perfectly and exploited it. Voroshilov became his chief informant in the army, reporting on his more talented colleagues, distorting the essence of their proposals and presenting any military discussion as insubordination and conspiracy. When Yakir proved the ineffectiveness of cavalry against tanks during exercises, Voroshilov perceived this not as a tactical dispute, but as a personal insult and an undermining of his authority. And he complained to Stalin. Stalin listened, nodded, and made notes in his notebook. He did not simply pit his marshals against each other. He created an atmosphere in which professional competence became suspect and unconditional personal loyalty became the main criterion for evaluation. The country would fully feel the consequences of this personnel disaster 4 years later, in June 1941. When German tank wedges tore the Soviet front defenses to shreds, the Red Army would desperately lack precisely those who had been shot in 1937-38. 3 out of 5 marshals, 13 out of 15 commanders, 8 out of 9 fleet flags, 50 out of 57 corps commanders, and 154 out of 186 division commanders were destroyed. The army was decapitated. The experienced commanders who had fought in the First World War and the Civil War, who had studied at academies and knew the potential enemy, were replaced by young upstarts whose main merit was loyalty, not talent. They would learn to fight on the fly, paying for their inexperience with the blood of millions of soldiers. The catastrophe of 1941 was a direct consequence of the tragedy of 1937. By executing Yakir, Stalin may have believed that he was strengthening his power, but in reality he was signing the death warrant of hundreds of thousands of soldiers who would perish in the cauldrons of the first months of the war. And yet, even knowing all this, it is difficult to fully understand what was going on in the mind of a man who shouted the name of his killer before he died. Perhaps the answer lies in the fact that, until the very end, he saw himself not as a person, but as a function, a cog in a huge mechanism. And if the mechanism decided that this cog was defective and needed to be replaced, it was his duty not to resist, so as not to disrupt the work of the whole machine. There was a terrible, twisted heroism in this. He did not die as Ion Yakir, husband, father, and commander. He died as Commander Yakir, a member of the Central Committee of the All-Union Communist Party Bolsheviks, who even in death had to serve the party. His last cry was not a plea for mercy or a curse, it was a report that he, a soldier of the revolution, had carried out his last order. An even more sinister aspect of this story is the fact that Stalin, in destroying his generals, was partly acting on the advice of his worst enemy. Today, historians have documented that the Nazi Security Service, SD, under the leadership of Reinhard Heydrich, carried out a disinformation operation. The Germans fabricated a dossier containing forged letters and documents allegedly proving the collusion of Tukhachevsky and other military leaders with the German General Staff. These forgeries were transmitted to Moscow through complex channels, including via Czechoslovakian President Edvard Beneš. Stalin, obsessed with spy mania and distrust of the old guard, received evidence that perfectly matched his own suspicions. The result was a monstrous paradox. Hitler, preparing for war, decapitated the army of his future enemy with Stalin's help. Yakir and his comrades fell victim not only to internal terror, but also to foreign policy intrigue, becoming pawns in the game of two dictators long before the first shot was fired on the battlefield. This machine of destruction worked on contrasts, and Stalin was a virtuoso master of psychological games. His hypocritical kindness lulled his victims into a false sense of security, making the subsequent blow even more devastating. Shortly before his arrest, at one of the Kremlin receptions, Stalin demonstratively approached Yakir, hugged him, and made a toast to "our eagle." He visited Yakir at home, played with his little son, Peter, creating the illusion of personal affection and the highest trust. For a person raised in a system of strict hierarchy, such attention from the leader was the highest reward, ruling out any thought of possible distrust. Therefore, when investigators burst into the cell at Lubyanka with accusations, the victim's consciousness refused to believe what was happening. It couldn't be Stalin. It was a mistake, a conspiracy by enemies against him, the leader. This belief in the good Tsar and the evil boyars was the last psychological refuge that allowed them to preserve their sanity in the face of total absurdity. The dictator's personal charisma and demonstrative favor were no less powerful weapons than the NKVD's torture conveyor belt. The logic of revolutionary necessity that Yakir had followed in suppressing peasant rebellions was now turned against him. He himself had participated in the creation of this ruthless axiom. For the sake of the higher goal, it is possible and necessary to sacrifice thousands of lives that the party declares hostile. He was a soldier accustomed to following orders, even if those orders required him to shoot hostages. Now the party was ordering him to become a traitor and die. To rebel, to shout his innocence in court, would mean more than just trying to save his own life. It would mean questioning the righteousness of the party itself, its infallibility. And if the party could be so monstrously wrong, then his whole life, all the blood he had shed on the fields of the Civil War and during punitive expeditions, lost all meaning. It turned him from a revolutionary hero into an ordinary murderer. His psyche, shaped by decades of party discipline, could not withstand such a collapse. It was easier to die, preserving his faith in the idea, than to live with the knowledge that his entire life had been a service to a bloody idol. His last cry was a desperate attempt to confirm to himself that his sacrifice had not been in vain. The story of Iona Yakir remains a bitter reminder of the power of blind faith in a totalitarian system. Despite torture, an unfair trial, and cynical disregard on Stalin's part, he remained loyal to the end. The facts of his life and death do not provide a clear answer to the question of his motives, but they do make us think about the price of conviction in an era of repression. Perhaps it was this faith that became his last consolation in the face of imminent death.